Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 8. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. So in the last episode, we ended up straying into the topic of Kubernetes and how you get started there. So I thought this time it might be worth a deep dive into that topic and some of the expertise and learnings that we've all had as we've learned Kubernetes. But I wanted to start first with the question, when does Kubernetes make sense? And what is it in the greater scheme of container technologies?
It makes sense when your job requires it, which is why I'm learning it.
I like to think of Kubernetes as just a state machine, really. So you are telling it how many copies of the application you want to run, what that application is made up of in terms of the container and the ingress and how its networking works, and it strives to maintain that state wherever possible. In its simplest form, that's kind of all it's doing. There's obviously a bunch more that it can do, but you're effectively giving a desired state for a containerized application, and it maintains it.
Okay, so stepping back a bit, we have the concept of a container that wraps up an application together with its dependencies and just enough operating system to work. So when is it that you go from having that container to using Kubernetes as the way to run it?
When you need to make money off of it. That's what it comes down to. If you're doing something that is going to affect livelihood, you need high availability, you need resilience, you might need load balancing. All those things you cannot achieve just running Docker on a host somewhere. That's going to require Kubernetes and orchestration.
So is it fair to say that Kubernetes is abstracting away the complexity of making your containers multi-node, or is it just trading one type of complexity for another?
There are trade-offs with all these things, right? Obviously, it's entirely possible to take a static website and Docker run it on 5 different nodes and then stick HA proxy in front of it. That is very simple, but you're taking complexity there by having to manage when those nodes are online and offline, manage what the health state of a given container is and how you would restart that when it was unhealthy. And you're kind of having to do that 5 times over. You're then having to put some kind of load balancing in front of that. If you want the load balancing to be highly available, you then have to have 5 HA proxy boxes or something like that. Whereas Kubernetes is trading that level of complexity for the complexity of running a fully orchestrated cluster with a database that underlies that and everything else. So you're moving the thing that's complex, but the thing that's complex isn't the orchestration of your workload, it's the thing that is orchestrating your workload.
And how does it compare to the other options that are in the clouds to running containers without as much of the Kubernetes configuration available? Things like your container instances or so forth.
So I think for me, it's the fact that it is a single language or a single product that you can learn that works across hybrid clouds. So you can run Kubernetes on-prem. All of the big cloud providers have a Kubernetes implementation. In fact, a few of the smaller cloud providers have a Kubernetes implementation. So I know that Linode does. I would imagine DigitalOcean also does. So for me, that's the real value of Kubernetes, is it's this learn once, run everywhere way to orchestrating containers at scale. You mentioned like Azure Container Service, and AWS has Elastic Container Service and things like Fargate that can achieve these. And those are really great if you don't have a huge operations team and all you want to do is run a container, but you are then learning those abstract concepts for each cloud provider.
I wanted to go down that road just before we delved into the details of Kubernetes, because I've seen a lot of people who have this broad idea that they need to get more container native, and then they immediately go straight to Kubernetes. And what I wanted to get into a little bit is, before you go straight to Kubernetes, maybe think that little bit through which bit you're trying to get rid of and what you're trying to achieve before going there. So assume that you are someone now who wants to get into Kubernetes and learn those basics. Where do you reach first?
So I think for me, if I were trying to learn the basics, I would try something like Microkates or K3S. That's certainly what I reached for when just trialing Kubernetes for this episode. I think they give you a very easy way of just getting started with a cluster. It is quite an opinionated cluster in that they've made a bunch of decisions around what parts of the Kubernetes stack run on which nodes, what your ingress controller looks like, everything like that. but it gives you a very easy way to get started. The cloud providers also do have these Kubernetes Getting Started guides for their own opinionated Kubernetes clusters, which are a really great way to start if you think that you're going to immediately be orchestrating on, say, AWS's EKS. But for me, I just spun up a VM locally and installed K3S. That felt like a reasonable place to begin.
That's a good point, that you don't have to have 5 nodes across 5 availability zones to get started with Kubernetes. It can just be your laptop as a single node Kubernetes cluster. And that works just as good as GKE or EKS or something. I personally got started using K3S. Like Gary said, there are some considerations taken into account, such as K3S comes out of the box with a load balancer technology already configured for you called Clipper. And it also comes, I think, with traffic as your ingress. And so if you don't know what you're doing and you just say spin up K3S, then that's awesome. But as you start to get more and more into it, you start to realize, okay, I actually want Nginx, or I actually want MetalLB, or now that I'm running this EKS, I don't need to have Clipper, right? I need to have whatever my cloud provider's load balancer technology is. So start by reading documentation, honestly, and figuring out exactly what you're getting by running these technologies, and then start figuring out, okay, do I need to disable this? Do I need to add something else? What am I going to miss?
It's interesting you mentioned K3S, and in particular that traffic ingress, because I am a beginner and I have been learning Kubernetes at the moment. And I decided as a little experiment, because I had no clue what Kubernetes was and how it worked, that I was going to lean on ChatGPT to tell me what to do. Because usually I use it with something I'm fairly comfortable with. So I have the guardrails to say, okay, you're going down the wrong direction. Let's dial this back a bit. But with Kubernetes, no clue. So I gave it a go, and I'm trying to be unbiased here, but I can't recommend it unless you want to go down red herring rabbit holes that are completely irrelevant to the problem you're actually having. I installed K3S. I didn't realize there was any sort of ingress networking going on. I told ChatGPT about that. It didn't tell me that networking was handled for me. At one point, I installed Nginx on the host operating system and Apache to try get it to work. It wouldn't work. I tried using the typical commands for like, what the hell is listening on port 80 and 443? I don't know what's going on. Nothing would respond. I spent hours with ChatGPT. It reached a point of like the definition of insanity where it kept repeating the same terrible steps for me to debug and then giving like the exact same response back. At that point, I gave up and I found a guide, and the guide explained all the context I needed. And I got everything working in like 10 minutes after about 6 hours of trying with ChatGPT.
Are you suggesting perhaps that curated documentation may be more useful in some cases than fancy autocomplete?
Not even curated documentation. Some random person's blog post probably 2 years ago was still more relevant than whatever ChatGPT could come up with.
When I first searched around in preparation for this, for getting started with Kubernetes, I found a couple of guides that were stepping through the broad approach of deploy a workload, change this thing, deploy a, deployment set, whatever. Is that the sort of approach you would take if you were trying to learn Kubernetes? Get yourself set up with a basic Kubernetes like a Microkates or a K3S, and then what would you do next? Would it be to follow a guide on deploying a container? Would it be to go through the different steps of using more advanced technologies in Kubernetes? What would you do next?
Well, I can tell you what I did the first time I ever deployed Kubernetes, and then I can tell you what I did this time, having been away from it for a couple of years. The first time I went through a guide by Kelsey Hightower on GitHub called Kubernetes the Hard Way. And that is basically spin up 3 machines and go and build the cluster from scratch yourself. And it was the hard way. It was a 13-step process to build, deploy, run, and destroy a Kubernetes cluster. But I did learn a lot about how some of those internal workings happened. So maybe, Shane, that would have answered some of your questions about what the hell is listening on port 80 and 443 here, because you'd have spun it up and had no ingress controller or no load balancing and had to build that stuff yourself. And that's kind of the way that I did it.
And that's what I was trying to say about earlier, where it's little things like what ports need to be opened, right? That wouldn't be something that you guys would just think of out of the box. Also, if you want to use the embedded database, then you need to use 3 nodes. Otherwise, you need to use an external database. That's not saying that just running the install script is going to tell you. You have to read the documentation and try to figure that out.
I guess that's what happens when you curl pipe to bash to get a full Kubernetes cluster, right?
Precisely.
That's fair. If you're just curl bashing, right, then you probably aren't going to read documentation. Good point.
But this time, yeah, I spun up K3S and I jumped straight to, well, how do I deploy a workload on this? And not just static website, but something that I actually might want to realistically run. So I got my K3S cluster running with 3 Ubuntu 24.04 nodes, and I decided I was going to deploy Nextcloud. It's a project that I have deployed. It is something that I'm familiar with running and have been running on my Docker host on my LAN here for a few years. So I knew that broadly I needed the container that was running Nextcloud, which I just used the Linux Server IO one. And I knew that I needed a MySQL database, and that would probably be enough to get me up and running. So I jumped straight into just pulling an example YAML for what does an application deployed in Kubernetes look like, and just sort of mangled that until I got something working. I kind of knew the ins and outs of the networking for Nextcloud and what needed to talk to what and how that worked. I was broadly aware of how the ingress controller was going to work and how the tagging worked in K3S. And I just grabbed a YAML file from a few years ago that I'd written and updated it to run the application, then did a kubectl apply, and then found out that my YAML file was fairly outdated and was trying to call Kubernetes APIs that no longer existed. But a little bit of troubleshooting later, within an hour or so, I had Nextcloud up and running. So it was way less difficult than I thought it would be.
It's interesting, isn't it? You can see arguments for both approaches where you go right back to the foundations and build it all up yourself so that you understand what you're doing at the scaffolding level, or going straight to using it for something useful and then trying to understand what goes around the outside. And when you look at the tools like the microcates of this world, you know, they're designed very much to get you up and running with containers or the workloads as quickly as possible, rather than understanding what's going into the magic of making that happen.
That's how cloud providers work, right? You're not going to care what CNI or CSI your Kubernetes cluster is running if it's on GKE. You just deploy your workload.
I guess the tricky thing there, though, is that when something breaks, you have Google or Amazon or Microsoft to lean on for support when there's some problem with your ingress controller or the cluster networking. Whereas when you've deployed this yourself, there isn't really anyone to reach out for support. I very much doubt that SUSE are going to support your hobby project that you're running on K3S.
Does it depend then on whether you are approaching this through the lens of, I want to be an application developer in a DevOps kind of role where I have to understand just enough of Kubernetes to get a workload running, versus someone who wants to work in something like a platform engineering function?
You've sort of intentionally or not broken down the two certifications that Kubernetes provides, which is application developer and administrator, which I'm looking at the moment as a sort of, I tend to do the same as yourself, Gary. I will just muck around with something. I'll find a problem I need to solve, and then I'll deploy it in this new technology. But I'm still not getting some of the like philosophical or reasoning why things are where they are. So I'm going to pick up probably a certification or two just to understand some of the background a bit more, mostly because I like the structure rather than just randomly perusing documentation.
And I think that's the real difference between the two approaches I took. The one I took 5 or 6 years ago when I first touched Kubernetes, and the one I took this time was, last time I was working in an infrastructure role, and I was much more interested in, well, how do I build the cluster and what makes the cluster up? And how do I choose between Podman versus Docker versus Containerd, and what are all the different CNIs I can use and the different underlying databases and all of that stuff. Whereas this time I approached it with that kind of application developer mindset of, cool, I've got a cluster now. How do I just get an application deployed and working on it? And I think depending on what you want to do and what your end goal is, both have their pros and cons. I think I would probably still lean more towards having a solid understanding of how the underpinnings are working. But maybe that's just because of the background that I come from, as opposed to, yeah, I can deploy an application on Kubernetes.
That's actually a great point. If I'm trying to get started and I know that I'm going to be an application developer, not so much administrator, would you recommend still somebody set up like a single node Kubernetes on their laptop or something or a VM? Or would you say go use GKE or EKS or something?
I'd lean towards setting it all up from scratch. And I only say this because I'm very embedded in cloud technologies. And what it made me realize playing around with Kubernetes is how little you get for free. Even Metal LLB or whatever it's called, that load balancer, it's like, oh yeah, I've got to set up my own load balancer. That sucks. You know, like the things you get for free that just you take for granted and forget about. You kind of need to remember that they exist again. So I'm going to go back to scratch again and not use K3S probably. I might follow that Kubernetes the hard way. I think I need it to de-cloud my brain.
Yeah, I think that's the really tricky thing, is that you don't necessarily understand what the cloud providers are giving you when you just click deploy in the console. And I think it's fine for I want to deploy an application and get it running, but it's not so fine when 6 months down the line, you're midway through a Kubernetes version upgrade and something breaks horribly. And you then need to understand why a certain service or a certain part of the cluster won't work, or say a node certificate expires and you can't work out why your nodes that you've got assigned to do routing won't route traffic into the cluster anymore. I think knowing how some of those nuts and bolts work is really useful. I don't necessarily think that you have to go and deploy it the hard way, although it sounds like it's maybe a valuable exercise. But I think understanding some of the nuts and bolts is useful. Like building an IKEA flat pack furniture versus learning to be a carpenter is probably the best way to put it.
I think that's why they've got those two courses as well. It's for that exact breakdown of like, are you an engineer who just has to interact with Kubernetes, or is it going to be your day job to keep this basic data center OS alive? Then you need to know these nuts and bolts. So it kind of depends on where you're approaching it from and why.
Have any of you seen value in those sort of courses that you can do around becoming a Kubernetes developer or Kubernetes administrator, or you haven't really come in contact with them?
I've not really come in contact with them because I was thrown in the deep end every time I've needed to use Kubernetes and have just sort of had to learn to tread water myself. But I think there probably is value if you have the luxury of time to go and do some of those courses. For me, it was like, we've a broken OpenShift cluster. We need to migrate out of this thing now, which is quite a different scenario to go and learn in, I think. And that's how I learn best. Some people learn better by having a really structured way of running through things. It just depends on, I think, what kind of learner and what kind of engineer you are for me.
Yeah, I have the luxury of time, and in a way don't have the luxury of immediate fires where I have to learn it. So I'll struggle to motivate myself to just get into the nitty gritty sometimes. So it's helpful for that. From the sounds of the certificate exams, it's not like some multiple choice box ticking exercise. You are in a hands-on lab where you are running clusters and debugging them. So it sounds hopefully fairly pragmatic, but time will tell. I'll give an update when I've done it.
Great, keep us posted. As a general statement, I've seen a lot of these sort of bigger technologies, things like OpenStack or Kubernetes or whatever, go through sort of development phases where everybody was really interested in getting into the nuts and bolts of how they worked and all the components and which was the best of this and which was the best of that. And then over time, it sort of tapers off into a more mature technology and you start to see more of these instant infrastructure and people worrying less about the components. Do you think there's something in the state of maturity of Kubernetes that changes how much into the nuts and bolts people want to get into versus how much they want an instant cluster to deal with?
I think when I started learning Kubernetes, maybe 7 years ago, there was no choice but to get into the nuts and bolts. There wasn't just a curl pipe bash, here's a cluster. The cloud providers had Kubernetes offerings, but they were fairly early and they were nowhere near as opinionated as they are now. So I remember spinning up a cluster in AWS and just getting an empty Kubernetes cluster with networking and having to work out how I decided what ingress controller to use, what load balancing technology to use and all that stuff. For me, that was a really valuable thing. I think now that some of the more opinionated, easy to spin up technologies exist, they're really useful for getting your feet wet with how to deploy something, but I still want to have that deploy the thing by hand and understand a bit more of how it works. Have people's attitudes changed? Probably, because I think the way that we structure engineering teams has gone on a little bit of a journey over the last 7 years or so. And there probably are very different personalities there to perhaps there were when I got started.
It's absolutely worth it to go and figure out the nuts and bolts by yourself, because even if you don't end up needing it right this second, come down the line, year, months later, whatever, you're working just as an application developer and something breaks, maybe like a GitOps pipeline breaks, you will be able to tell your platform engineering team, hey, I know this X, Y, and Z. Let's try to solve this quickly, versus you just kind of throwing it over there and hoping that they'll get around to it, right? It's definitely worth it to understand what you're doing on your own and then working with your other team members, and then also hopefully disseminating the information and teaching your more junior engineers this kind of valuable skills.
If we think the value is there in the nuts and bolts from a learning exercise, is the nuts and bolts worthwhile there in a production environment as well? Would you also recommend doing the work to craft your Kubernetes in a production environment, or there is it better to just take something that's as shrink-wrapped as possible?
So you're trying to ask if you have like a home lab, like a home Kubernetes cluster, to run it as production, right? To treat it as production, or are you trying to make the distinction between playing around with it versus trying to do it in a very production way?
I was going all the way to the other end where you're talking about an organization that is actually using Kubernetes.
I would, as a platform engineer, want to do as little as possible in production. I want to own as little of the stack as possible. The thing I care about is making engineers productive, not operating data centers myself. So I would always lean towards thinnest possible platform, use as much commodity and off the shelf as possible so that I can think about the things that make engineers more productive.
It's still absolutely valuable. For example, at work, we have 2 Kubernetes offerings. One is basically just GKE with the corporate networking. And the other one is an on-prem GitOps using Argo on-prem cluster. And we didn't understand at the time what the differences were. We started going down this on-prem GitOps workflow, and then we had an outage and we needed to roll back. And our pipelines take about 10 minutes or so to complete. And so I tried just doing, it was a Helm chart, right? So I was just Helm roll back or Helm undo. And I tried to roll that deployment back and I couldn't, because GitOps says if you're going to do this, you have to control this at the Git level. So instead, I had to go and do a git revert and then push that through my pipeline. So I had to wait 10 minutes to fix the downtime because I was using a Kubernetes platform that was specifically configured and I could not change for Argo, CD, and GitOps. If I had known that, I'd probably have a better backup mechanism or better rollback strategy.
I think for me, I would err more on the side that Shane was on, of take as much out of the box from a cloud provider as you can, but understand what it is that they're doing for you. So what I mean by that is, like, if you're running it on AWS, understand what their ingress controller and what their networking is doing, so that if you need to replicate that or change that in another cloud or on premises, you can. Don't just assume components are there and that they're available everywhere.
That's what I was talking about when I said like decloudifying my brain. Absolutely. You should know the nuts and bolts, but then don't deploy the nuts and bolts, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Just take something that is going to be easy for you to run, upgrade, and support, and something that when things do break, you can phone your cloud provider and they also know what you're working with and that you haven't changed out some core component somewhere.
Great. Well, before we go, just a quick thank you to all of our PayPal supporters and patrons. If you'd like to join those people, you can at hybridcloudshow.com/support. where for various amounts on Patreon you can get an ad-free feed of either just this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows, and sometimes you get episodes early. If you do like the show and what we're doing, please share it with friends. We're still building the audience. And if you've got any questions or feedback, please send those to show@hybridcloudshow.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.